Go ahead and start sharing. All right, welcome. We're talking about the right bank of Bordeaux. We're continuing on in a series of Bordeaux lectures that we've been discussing a little bit more in depth. It's such a fascinating region with such a rich history and tradition, but not to mention also really a lot of modern examples of moving forward during a newer age and an age of climate change are taking place in Bordeaux, which I think is just absolutely exciting when you consider, Rick is drinking 2015 Château Garonne. Please feel free to share what you're drinking in the chat box. And if any of you have been to Bordeaux, we always like to say, please take the time to maybe share some of your experiences in the chat box. We always love learning collectively from our community about the areas that you've traveled, maybe the restaurants that you enjoyed, maybe you ate, at places on the right bank where you got to overlook Château Cheval Blanc and others. So please feel free to share those trips with the group, or let us know if you are going. And maybe we'll ask you about where you're going too. So talking about Bordeaux is not necessarily an easy task, I would certainly say. There's a lot to discuss, which is why we're breaking this down into kind of three a little bit easier, more digestible sections that you might see. Here you can see the village of Saint-Émilion. We're talking about the right bank, or primarily an area known as the Libournais today. And you can see that the vineyards really almost push up right against the city itself. And in fact, many of the Premier Grand Cru Class A estates that we're going to be discussing are situated in this plateau around the city and the village itself. So much like, in a way, where you see Burgundy, kind of the vineyards abutting a lot of these villages, you see a little bit more of that on the right bank of Bordeaux. Now, is right bank Bordeaux very different from left bank Bordeaux? Definitely in some ways, which is why they really have those two distinctions. I wonder if we were to rewrite sort of the AOC laws today and reclassify the land itself, if we might actually consider them to be two distinct regions, because, quite frankly, the climate is different. The soil types are different. And although we tend to use the same family of grape varieties, the proportion that we grow these grapes in and make these wines in are really quite different between the left and the right bank. So it is quite interesting that we, much like the Rhone Valley, right, we consider collectively the North and Southern Rhone as one area for wine, when they're really, really distinct in their soils, their climates, and their grape varieties, much like Bordeaux. Kind of interesting, huh, when you think about it that way. So hopefully many of you have been enjoying our partnership with Ledoux Wines. They're a really fantastic wine shop located in the West Village here in Manhattan. So we have two really fun wines that, if you're drinking these today, I'd love to know what your impressions are. So we decided to go with two vintages that were both pretty standout for the right bank, particularly in the past decade. So 2010 is known for being one of the best vintages of Bordeaux. It does have a ripeness to it, and we'll talk about vintages at the end of class, but there's a ripeness to 2010, but still a structure that lends a little bit of the classicism of Bordeaux. And, what is the classic Bordeaux style, right? That style is shifted over the past several decades. So we'll talk a bit about that. So first we have Castillon, Côte de Bordeaux, which we're going to discuss the Côte de Bordeaux a couple of different times throughout the evening tonight. This is the Monrecueil 2010. It's the second wine. We'll discuss that too. I know many of you probably joined Ryan last week or the week before, so you've had an opportunity to be exposed to a lot of these terms. And many of you are probably savvy drinkers, and you seek out a lot of second wines of the estates on your own as well. So the second wine of Château de Belcier, established at the end of the 18th century. The owner at the time, the estate was established in the 1780s, and in 1794, the owner, Francois de Belsier, was guillotined. He was an anti-revolutionist. He was guillotined by the armies of Napoleon, excuse me. And I thought this was kind of morbid to leave in, but I also think that we're talking about a region that's steeped in so much rich history, and the effects of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Code, which mandated splitting up property between equal heirs, was really less important to Bordeaux. And we'll kind of talk about that with the history of why Bordeaux was affected so little comparatively to other regions like Burgundy, right? Today, and we're going to talk a lot about this too. So this is all just leading up to where we're going tonight, right? Today, Monrecueil and Belsier belong to MACIF, the mutual insurance company. They really have revamped the estate to its former magnificence. It is not cheap to own land and pay taxes in Bordeaux. I think this is something that is also really important to understand when we talk about how so many properties are being consolidated under the umbrella of larger parent companies like insurance holdings, like luxury companies, right, like LVMH, and under single ownerships or families that own multiple brands. It's not easy to own a lot of these larger, more grand chateaus that were built in the 1700s, in the in the 18th century, and to pay property on the taxes, especially when this property is being inherited. Maybe an older family member passes away. It's a lot of taxes on these properties, or when some partial property owners aren't involved in the winemaking or the grape growing, and they just simply want to cash out their share. So there's a lot that we'll be talking about today. The wine, this wine is 80% Merlot with equal parts of Cabernet Franc and Malbec, and it's aged in both barrel and tank. And I think that the Castillon is a place that's often overlooked, even by the French in Bordeaux, for value wine that is really quality driven. And we're just off of the same kind of limestone plateau that we see in Saint-Émilion. So it's really a great place to look for value wine, especially in a really great vintage, when you know that the winemakers really had the opportunity to do their best, regardless if they have that, kind of centuries of technique behind this particular winery or not. The next wine that we sent is the Saint-Émilion Grand Cru. Keep this in mind because we're going to talk about this concept as well. Château Poesia 2016. They're located in the eastern portion of Saint-Émilion, so they would be closer to Castillon. We'll look at a map in a moment. It was known by a different name, OVA, until it was purchased in 2014 by two co-owners, one of which also owns Bodegas Poesia in Argentina. They also own several different properties in Saint-Émilion, Pomerol, and also Pessac-Léognan on the left bank. Here we see 70% Merlot with 30% Cabernet Franc. This is a pretty common blend that we might see somewhere like Saint-Émilion, and it's aged in French oak for 18 to 24 months. So I'd love to see if anybody has some comments tasting these two different wines. I'd love to hear what you think about them. And today, as I was looking into these two wines, I found this quote on the website for Château Poesia, which I thought would really kind of struck a chord with me with the new, more sustainable Bordeaux that we're going to be talking about a lot in the future. And as the quote said, we do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. And I think that the Bordelais are really looking to this, style of agriculture and viticulture that is not only borrowed from ancestors, but also is paving the way for the people that will be in the region to make wine far after we're gone. So it's pretty cool. So where are we? We're in Bordeaux. We're about 2/3 down the western coast of France. Bordeaux is one of the largest wine growing regions in France. They make a lot. They are 5 times the size of, for example, one of the other most prestigious regions of Burgundy. And there's a lot of plantings here. The Loire Valley looks like it takes up a much larger amount of space, but the plantings are much less dense than we see in Bordeaux. We've seen centuries of successive plantings here in different areas and different subregions of Bordeaux. They've sort of ebbed and flowed and waned and gained in popularity. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. We are in a definitively maritime climate. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because we'll talk about the climate in a moment, but waterways are extremely important to Bordeaux. Oftentimes we learn a lot of sort of superficial facts about wine regions, and usually it's all we really need to know to make an educated decision on the type of wine that we want to drink, or the amount of money we want to spend, or the producer that we want to support. But you know, Bordeaux is the way that it is because of 2,000 years of history, and it's not really only one point in time or one event, either catastrophic or great, that happened in this region to make it the way that it is today, right? It's the compounding of all of these events. It's the fact that it's such an incredibly strategic location. Not only is it on the Atlantic, it's accessible to other countries like Spain, Portugal, Dutch, the Netherlands, and England, of course, but they also have a lot of waterways that flow through this area. It's incredibly important for commerce as well, which really helped build Bordeaux into the place that it is in terms of its global presence on the world stage, right? They had the opportunity to send these wines out. Many people had the opportunity to drink and taste and become to love the styles of wine that they were producing there. But it's not only about if you got to drink it, how much you like it, who owned what and when, right? So we'll get into all of that. Today, we're primarily talking about, we're only talking about the right bank. We will talk a little bit about the left bank as we need to in reference to Bordeaux in general. So a lot of the history we'll talk about is sort of what Ryan covered. We'll just briefly go over it, discussing a lot of the things that happened on the left bank. The right bank, although it was really, especially places like Fronsac and Canon-Fronsac were really important during the 18th century as well, but they really kind of waned in importance after the classification of the Medoc, which we'll discuss a little bit. But if you have any questions, because I'll probably skip over a lot of the things as it pertains to the left bank, but if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody in your wine community on this call could even answer those questions for you as well. So please don't hesitate to ask. So today we'll be talking about primarily Saint-Émilion and Pomerol. We'll be talking about their satellite appellation. There's a single satellite appellation for Pomerol and 4 satellite appellations for Saint-Émilion. Fronsac and Canon-Fronsac, these areas here. We'll be talking about Bourg and Blaye, and then also the area that's known as the Côtes de Bordeaux. The Côtes de Bordeaux was consolidated just about a decade ago to try to bring a little bit of ease into understanding some of these really kind of convoluted Bordeaux nomenclature. But I'm not sure if they succeeded or not. We'll go over it, and you can tell me if you think some of the newer classifications actually make any sense here. So most of the regions we're talking about today produce red wine only. A few of them can produce styles of dry or sweet white wines as well. So what's the climate like in Bordeaux? Why is Merlot or Cabernet Sauvignon so different coming from Bordeaux than somewhere like Napa Valley or Margaret River in Australia, right? Or somewhere like South Africa or Argentina or Chile? Why are these styles of the same grape variety so distinct coming from Bordeaux? So it really is the kind of the perfect grouping of climatic factors. Obviously, we talk about the human element who had grown grapes in these regions and made wine in Bordeaux, compounding for centuries, right? Obviously, not one guy making wine for centuries, but that collective knowledge that gets passed down from owner to owner, or from father to son or mother to daughter and so forth. So the climate here is really governed by its proximity to the Atlantic Ocean. As it pertains to the right bank, as we move inland, it is a little bit more continental, but we still see these pretty maritime climate with these warmer summers and cool winters. We don't have the extreme seasonality that we see in many of the more inland regions in France, talking about places like Champagne, like Burgundy, like Beaujolais, and so forth. There's no true dry season. There's more rainfall in Bordeaux than any other major wine region in France. And this is both a good and a bad thing. Rain can draw some hazards though. In springtime, it can interrupt the flowering and that reduces yield. So sometimes you'll see talk about a particular vintage, especially in Bordeaux, and they'll say something like yield very low because of springtime rains and poor flowering, but quality really high. So the yield is not necessarily a reflection of the end quality of the wine, as long as there was still a decent growing season. The yield and the flowering really just talk about how many grapes you'll actually get off of your vine. So the same thing happens in places like Burgundy. Maybe you have a frost or freeze or hailstorm during the flowering or strong winds in other regions of the world. And this just reduces yield. So if it ends up being a really good vintage with low yields, what happens then? During our future tastings, Bordeaux jacks up the price, right? And they sell that lesser amount of high quality wine for more money. During the harvest season, the grapes can rot. Rain can invite a lot of rot. It dilutes the grapes. If we pick the grape too close to the rainfall, it causes damage to the skins, which can split the skins and invite other types of disease or rot into the grapes or off flavors. We don't want to dilute the grape. We don't like picking too close to the rain when the grapes have swelled, because they will be diluted, the final wine. But producers oftentimes in a region like Bordeaux have to make that choice between ripeness and picking before the rain. So sometimes it's a really difficult decision to make, and not every producer always gets it right. And you might think something like, well, usually it doesn't rain every day during the harvest season, right? I'll tell you, I lived in Seattle for 8 years, and I will tell you there are months where it rains every single day in a climate like that. However, that's usually further into the winter, so it would be after what I would compare to the harvest season in Bordeaux. But what happens when you have, 1 or 2 nice days in between rain? Well, everybody's trying to pick on those days. So it's not necessarily advantageous for these estates, right? So just one of those things to think about the idea of how winemakers and grape growers do choose to go about harvesting their grapes. So we don't want it to be diluted. We want to pick when it's dry, better quality of the wine that will be made. The climate leading up to what we were just saying is notoriously unpredictable, and this really contributes to these wild swings in vintage quality. And sometimes it is related to when the winemakers do have to choose to pick. The right bank is generally drier than the left. And there are greater seasonal temperature swings than we see in places like the Medoc, where the climate's just a little bit more maritime, even in the Medoc, than it is slightly further inland. If you remember looking at our map before, the Libournais that we're talking about is located further inland from something like the Medoc is here and the Libournais is over here. As we move inland, the elevation and the land climb. A much more interesting topography in inland Bordeaux than it is in places like the Medoc. There's a lot more plateaus and rolling hills, variable exposures by comparison to the Medoc, which is fairly flat. We see a lot more cool clay and calcareous clay soils, although there's a big variety of soils on the right bank, which include gravel, kind of a gravel strip in Saint-Émilion and Pomerol that we'll see. But also as you move closer to the Dordogne River, the tributary of the Garonne, or many of the other smaller rivers or streams that intersect the right bank, you do see more alluvial soils that are deposited by water. You see ice age glacial deposits, which we'll talk about in Pomerol, and you do see some sand as well as you move down closer to the plain. On the right bank, generally the blend encompass around 70% Merlot and 30% Cabernet Franc. Will that change? Merlot is just a sugar hoarder. It loves to ripen. And that's why, again, it's not just that Merlot only does better in clay soils. It's the reasons of why. And why don't we have Cabernet Sauvignon here? Why don't we have a lot of Malbec here, but we have more Cabernet Franc and Merlot, right? Merlot ripens really easily. It's a very vigorous grape variety, meaning it will grow a lot of the canopy, the leaves, right? Instead of concentrating on ripening its grapes. And these cool clay soils are better for Merlot, which is an early ripening grape. Cabernet Sauvignon can rarely ripen efficiently on the right bank. But aside from the fact that Merlot is early ripening and can ripen in these soils, the soils actually help to slow down the velocity of the growing of Merlot. So it helps temper a little bit of that vigorousness that you do see in growing these grape leaves, and helps it focus more on ripening the fruit of the berries as well. We do see on the right bank that the estates are much smaller. Rarely the largest exceed 20 or 25 hectares. This is minuscule by comparison to some of the classified growths in the Medoc, including the first growth. They are, as of now, more family owned, but we're seeing a lot of brands being consolidated under single ownership, as we spoke about earlier. And as they're being consolidated under single ownership or shareholders or larger corporations, the vineyards are growing in size, and the estates are sometimes absorbing others rather than keeping that as a different estate. Now, we kind of mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different reasons that this happens, right? Taxes are incredibly high, so people might have to sell off parts of their vineyard to surrounding estates. Oftentimes, as I mentioned before, siblings or other family members that aren't directly involved in the winemaking or grape growing, they don't want to be involved, and they'd rather take their part of the money out of the estate, so they have to sell. That's what happened with Michel Rolland and his family estate that had been in the family since the 1920s. In 2013, he had siblings that didn't want to own the estate, and they ended up having to sell, even though it was kind of like his baby. We'll talk about Michel Rolland a little bit later. It sold to a Hong Kong investor. So we're really seeing more of this consolidation. And garagiste, or the garage culture, really started on the right bank, sparked by Château Valandrode in Saint-Émilion. Today they are a classified growth in Saint-Émilion, but in the 1990s, 90, 91, we had these estates that were not as well known as some of the class growths of Saint-Émilion, of which there were not very many at that time, or some of the best estates of Pomerol. I mean, Petrus is the one we would discuss there, right? And so they didn't have as great of terroir, and they started to craft super small production, really low yield, intensely extracted wines. They were severely selected in the vineyard, so it was only like the most perfect, ripest berry that you could find. They had tons of new oak on them, and sometimes they were called the antithesis of terroir. The garage wines were really more considered to be triumphs of technique than something to look at the terroir of the land through. Today, a lot of those styles have pulled back, but we do see the importance of these garage wineries, and they are starting to focus more on the terroir as well. So why is Bordeaux the way that it is? So many reasons. So first, it was named initially by a Celtic tribe who lived in the area, and we don't quite have evidence that they were making wine and growing grapes themselves, but it is possible. They established Burdigala near the Garonne, as they called the city, It became the capital of the Roman province of Aquitaine. They came in the 15th century of the Common Era. They expanded commerce, they planted vines, they built walls, they did all of the Roman things that we would expect. We see waves of Germanic invaders attack the region. They sacked the city of Burdigala several times. But it wasn't until Clovis, who was the first king of France, expelled the Visigoths that he inherited the city and changed the name to Bordeaux, which stands today. And the city during this time, it was important during Roman times, but really emerges as an important port city of trade. When you go to the city of Bordeaux and you look at the grandeur of the buildings and the architecture and the culture, it really is an homage to the wealth that this city amassed over millennia as a trading port. Now, we talk a lot about this, you've probably heard it before, but this is really what cemented the fame of the Bordeaux region. It probably would not be as famous as it is today without Eleanor of Aquitaine. So she was a duchess. She inherited Aquitaine from her father, Charles X, when he passed away. She was, probably I think she was around 13 years old, and she was betrothed to Louis VII, who was about to become the King of France. So they were married. He became the King of France. She bore him 2 daughters. But they quarreled a lot. There was a lot going on during this time. And there was, during the Crusades, sorry, let me back up here a second. So during the Crusades, her and Louis VII are quarreling a lot. She's able to bear him 2 daughters, but no sons. And so she doesn't really like her husband, and she goes to the Pope, who's on the front line during all of these battles, and she petitions for an annulment to her marriage. Now, because she can't bear him a son, the Pope grants her annulment. And why it's important that this was an annulment was because she was able to retain all of her property after this annulment. So shortly thereafter, she's married to Henry II. He's the Duke of Normandy, and he's the future King of England. And she becomes the Queen of England when he becomes king. And this is when the region of Aquitaine, which is not only the area of Bordeaux, but also most of the land around it, expanding into southwest France and down to the Pyrenees on the border with Spain, become part of the English House of Plantagenet. So this is one of the really important markers, milestones in Bordeaux, when France, the region of Bordeaux, now becomes part of England for 300 years. And they establish, it's really the English who come up with this great thirst for Bordeaux wine, and they really establish a competitive advantage for the wines of the port city. They wouldn't let wine be sold between December 1st and September 1st from anywhere else in the region. So all of the advantageous Bordeaux wines would have been sold already during this time. The English developed their taste for claret, which is a lighter style, almost rosé-like or very light red style of Bordeaux. And at the conclusion of the 100-Year War in 1453, the region goes back to French rule. And in the 1600s, we see kind of a new middleman superpower begin to emerge. So the Dutch really controlled the seas. They probably had around 1,500 ships in their fleet during this time, compared to England had 600 and France had 50. They really ruled the world. They created the East India Shipping Company, which is the world's first kind of global monopoly. But they began to gain an interest in Bordeaux as well. And they really enjoyed a deeper, darker style of red wine. And they had a lot of interest in the sweet wine coming from the region of Bordeaux as well. Now, the biggest contribution that the Dutch would give to Bordeaux is the concept of draining the left bank, the Medoc, of its marshland, much like they did in their home country of the Netherlands. And they built a series of canals to drain the Medoc. And this is really what became the large gravel croupes that would become the regions of Pauillac, especially on the left bank of Bordeaux, which you probably heard from Ryan early on. Samuel Pepys was an English Parliament member and writer. and he talks about the wines of Aubryon in 1663, probably one of the first wines that was really mentioned by the name of the chateau or the estate as opposed to the region. So this is really important. And actually the owner of Aubryon opened a tavern in London so that he could sell his wines by name. So this was one of the first times that people began ordering the wine not by, Bordeaux, not by Fronsac, not by Burgundy, but instead by an actual name of an estate, Aubryon. It was followed by Latour and Lafite, became known by name soon after. In the 1700s, we start to see all of the chateaux being built. Bordeaux at this time is a very, very wealthy economy. There's a lot of noble aristocrats in the area, but not just the church and aristocrats, but there's also a lot of merchants in the area. And as we move into the late 1700s and the French Revolution began to take place, one of the main things that happened was that a lot of property, and especially wine vineyards, were seized from the church and noblemen, and they were given to the kind of middle merchant class, right? Well, a lot of the merchant class already existed in Bordeaux, and because they were so wealthy, a lot of them were able to circumvent a lot of Napoleon's laws for the Napoleonic Code. They built they gave a lot of their land to shareholders and were able to circumvent a lot of these laws. Napoleon III in 1855 commissioned the classification of the top Bordeaux estate, but this classification is only of the Medoc on the left bank. 57 chateaux are selected for red wine and 21 for the sweet wines of Sauternes. We don't see a classification of the right bank until 1955, which we'll get into in a little bit. A lot of problems in the 1800s. Odium, phylloxera, peronospora, these are downy and powdery mildew, really devastate the vineyards. A student and Emile Pinaud come up with kind of what's known as the Bordeaux mixture, which is a mixture of copper sulfate, lime, and water. And copper prohibit mold from growing. So the problem is that we see today is Bordeaux mixture is allowed in organic viticulture, but it does build up in the vineyard over time. So we do see producers who are looking towards using even less of this more natural Bordeaux mixture and using other forms of mold and mildew management. Some of that through planting grape varieties that are not as susceptible to mold and mildew. And the AOC system is established in 1936. In 1956, many of the vines in Bordeaux were wiped out by a deep freeze. Christian Mouek said that the temperature during this deep freeze that took place during February, a winter freeze, dipped down to negative 23 degrees Celsius for many days in a row. And this freeze affected many other regions in France. The Rhone was heavily affected as well. But what it did in Bordeaux was that it wiped out pretty much all of the Malbec, which up to this point was one of the main grapes. We didn't even see Cabernet Sauvignon come into the fold until the mid 1800s in Bordeaux, but Malbec was one of the most planted grapes. Most of the wine probably would have been made from Malbec and then some of these ancillary grapes. But we lost almost all of them. And when we replanted with other grape varieties. So we began to replant with Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot, which were already present, but were a little less prone to the frost here as well. So really important milestone. We have a lot of mixed vintages in the 1960s and 70s. 1982 was the changing point for Bordeaux. This was one of the very first, most opulent vintages that we began to see. Robert Parker was a big fan, and he touted the 1982 vintages and the warmer, plusher style that came out of Bordeaux in the 1980s and 1990s, and even the 2000s. The 2008 economic crash really had a big impact on the economy, and a lot of these trophy wine that bankers and people would have on the table when you would go out to lunch, Latour, Lafite, Aubryon, Margaux, etc., were suddenly not in fashion anymore. So we see a big shift in 2008 as well, and that's really when we start to see the style of the more opulent Bordeaux become slightly more reserved again. All right, we're done. History is over. We can move on now. But I think, as I always say, it's so important to understand why a region has been shaped the way that it has. And it really helps us to understand how we can move forward as well. So we know about the AOC system established in 1936. If you put Saint-Émilion or Pomerol or Pauillac, right, or Sauterne on your label of wine, you have to adhere to that region's laws regarding where you can plant your grapes, what grape varieties you can plant, your yields, how many grapes you can get off of every vine, how ripe they have to be, how you have to manage your vineyard, and what you have to do within your winery. In Bordeaux, there's not as many laws regarding winemaking technique. There's definitely a Bordelais style, but it's not necessarily codified into law for how long you have to keep your wine in barrel or whether you do or not. We are starting to see a movement into more laws around vineyard management. We also have the Vin de Pays, or the regional, departmental, or local IGP category, and also the Vin de Table, which is now Vin de France. It can include a grape variety and a vintage. We have generic appellations in Bordeaux, which we won't spend too much time on. There are 39 AOPs altogether within the region. There are 3 regional appellations. So these are sort of your entry-level appellations. It's important to understand that in France, Bordeaux AOP, the generic general Bordeaux category, in which grapes can come from anywhere in the larger area of Bordeaux, the right or the left bank. It can be red, white, can be dry or sweet, it can be rosé, it can be claret. These wines sell for an average of €6 in France. The entry-level Bordeaux wines are really quite inexpensive, and the quality is not what we really think of when we consider more of the communal appellations. We do have a step up in the entry level, which is Bordeaux Superior. You can also produce dry reds, medium sweet whites. The production regulations are much more strict for how you grow your grapes and make your wine when it comes to Bordeaux Superior, lower yields, longer minimum aging before release, etc. And then the third generic appellation is Cremant de Bordeaux. So sparkling wine can be white or rosé, and spend a minimum of 9 months aging on the lees, in the same style that you would see in champagne. So aging and then being sold in the champagne bottle, in the sparkling wine bottle, looked like a champagne bottle that the wine is eventually sold in. We also have sub-regions. The Medoc itself is its own AOC. Graves is an AOP or AOC, Entrée de Mer. The right bank does not necessarily have its own sort of sub-regional appellation, but it does have the Côte de Bordeaux, which we'll talk about. And then we see the village appellation. So on the right bank, this would include things like Saint-Émilion, Saint-Émilion Grand Cru. They're the same thing. Don't be fooled, even though you can list either on your label. Any of the satellite appellations, Pomerol, Canon, and Canon Fronsac, as well as the Côte de Bourg as well. And then it's important to understand, so no single vineyard or single estate appellations exist, even though we think of the estates as being classified in Bordeaux as opposed to the land being classified, but the estates themselves are not their own AOP. There is one estate that has been petitioning to gain its own AOP, and that is Château Le Py, who is located in the Côte de Bordeaux Francs region, which is just to the east of Saint-Émilion, and they are a very, very highly regarded high quality estate, and they have been classifying or petitioning to the INAO to gain their own AOP because they have a very distinctive terroir. They've been there since the 1600s, and it's been family owned for a very, very long time, I think for just as long. So they've been petitioning saying, we've been making wine in this way on this terroir. We are special. There are no other wines like ours in France. So they really think that they deserve their own AOP. So Merlot is the most planted grape variety. And this is advantageous on the right bank because Merlot is the main grape. It's also the most planted grape variety in France, not just in Bordeaux, but you can see it more than doubles the planting of even the second most planted grape variety, which is Cabernet Sauvignon. It ripens early. It adds some more soft, plummy fruit cake flavors to the wine. It has a more concentrated mid palate. It has softer tannins than Cabernet Sauvignon. So the blend tends to be much more velvety. The right bank is known as being Merlot based for this soft, plush ripeness that it really gets to the wine. Cabernet Sauvignon is the king of the left bank. It was a natural crossing that occurred in the vineyards of the Medoc in probably the mid 1800s. It ripens much better in the gravel soils of the Medoc. Why are those gravel soils there? Because of the Dutch. Think of it. I mean, maybe that place could still be marshland and we would never have known Chateau Lafite, right? Or Mouton Rothschild or Latour. Can you even imagine that horror? So it adds a lot of tannin, a lot of dark fruit character from Cabernet Sauvignon. Cabernet is austere and Merlot is soft and plush. Cabernet Franc is rare on the left bank, but very common on the right bank. It adds acidity and herbal aromatics and flavors to the wine. On the right bank, Cabernet Franc stands in for the structure of Cabernet Sauvignon. When Merlot needs more acidity, when it needs more tannin and structure, we're adding Cabernet Franc. There is Cabernet Sauvignon on the right bank, and it's really well known for one estate, which we'll discuss. Petit Verdot, very little plantings left, used in small percentages to add color, sometimes some aromatic spice to the wine, a little bit of backbone and structure as well. You find it more on the left bank. Semillon is your top white grape, tend to be waxy and rich. We won't really be talking about the white today because we don't see very many of them on the right bank. Sauvignon Blanc, we know, grassy, pungent, high acid. In Bordeaux, it's usually barrel aged. You have these peachy and green aromatic flavored with vanilla. It's really beautiful. Muscadel is added to white wines for a little bit of floral aromas. And you see Malbec, Carmenere, and then also on the right bank, you see Uni Blanc and Colombard, especially as well. And recently, 7 new grape varieties for Bordeaux and Bordeaux Superior were added. These are Touriga Nacional, the grape from Portugal, Arena Noa, the crossing, Marcelin, which is a crossing, Castettes, Alvarinho, Petit Manseng, and Lilo Rila. And now I want people to understand that these grapes have just been approved for planting. So most producers that are looking to experiment with these grapes are now planting them in very, very small amounts to see how they will do within their vineyard. And then they'll start playing with them in the blend, but there'll be a very, very small amount towards the Bordeaux style blend right now. We're not going to in 2022, or, I guess 2022 wouldn't be coming out yet, but we don't have wine being made from a blend of half Touriga Nacional and Marcelin that are about to hit the market. They're going to be in very small amount to really help, kind of stemmy this global warming that we're definitely seeing within Bordeaux. And global warming is a benefit in some ways for Cabernet Sauvignon and even Cabernet Franc, but definitely not for Merlot. And most of the plantings, as you can see in Bordeaux, are Merlot. So as the climate gets warmer in Bordeaux, we'll have to replace Merlot with other things, and it will become a lesser portion of the blend over time as well. It's kind of a fun map to look at. How are these grapes related? We oftentimes you hear the term Bordeaux blend or Bordeaux style. So there are two things that really means. The first is that it's referring to a blend of the white or red grape varieties that you see for their respective wines within Bordeaux. Cabernet Franc and Sauvignon Blanc crossed in the vineyard to make Cabernet Sauvignon. There's a relationship that's undetermined yet between Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon. Merlot is the offspring of Cabernet Franc and a rare grape called Madeleine Noir de Charente, as well as Malbec. So those are siblings. Carmenere is the offspring of Cabernet Franc and Gros Cabernet. So many of these grape varieties are related, and they have a great affinity for one another, which I think we really see as well. So let's talk a little bit about viticulture. We won't spend too long on this because I want to get into some of the talking about some of these regions. There's not as many to talk about on the right bank as on the left bank, so we still have a little bit of time here. The simple guillot is a more common style of vine training for the right bank than the double guillot that you oftentimes see on the left bank, using just a single arm that is temporary. And then the next year, a different kind of a different part of the vine or a different arm will be used for the main growth of the grapes on the vine. The planting density on the right bank tends to be higher than we see on the left bank because the shallows are more, the soils are more shallow. The roots don't penetrate the limestone bedrock quite as deeply. Canopies tend to be higher, slightly more frost prone, and the more continental inland here. We've talked about already, modern Bordeaux is moving more towards organic and sustainable viticulture. 8% of vineyards are certified organic, and most producers do take some sort of kind of lutte raisonnée, what we call the reasoned approach to the reasoned fight to viticulture, meaning that rather than spraying artificial or chemical herbicides, insecticides, and fertilizers systemically, they use them only when they really need to. So the lutte raisonnée approach, kind of taking into consideration the needs of the environment instead. But powdery and downy mildew really are constant threats in this area, but we do see herbicide and fertilizer use are being reduced. We know about the Bordeaux mixture. And in 2019, Saint-Émilion decreed, part of the appellation law now, right? Part of what they have to do in their vineyard with their viticulture. They said that all viticulture has to be certified sustainable. So certified sustainable with the acceptable method at the minimum of the lutte raisonnée, or to fully organic or biodynamic. So herbicides have been banned from Saint-Émilion entirely. So if you are a producer or a grape grower in Saint-Émilion that is growing your grapes with more conventional methods, you have to declassify your wine. You can no longer use the term Saint-Émilion on your bottle of wine. Today we have 600 certified organic growers and 47 biodynamic growers in Bordeaux, which is really cool for a region that had long before you used to hear people say we're Bordeaux, we can't be organic or biodynamic. The weather is just simply too hard. But there's a lot of producers proving that that's just not true. So we see the same vinification technique that we see on the left bank. A lot of selection in the vineyard, green harvesting during the summer months, which is dropping some of the bunches of fruit to concentrate the ripening in the fruit that is left. Oftentimes the grapes, once they get into the winery, are sorted by optical or density sorters. An optical sorter, you can see a picture here. Essentially, this is the barrel room at Les Pins, so a garage, small garagiste, garage style winery in Pomerol. And then you can see this is an optical sorter. A lot of producers that have density and optical sorters in their vineyards are now going back to sort of hand sorting as well. So I think a lot of producers are moving toward this kind of more neoclassical style, right? As opposed to all super new and super modern. So this is an optical sorter. Your grape drop in. There's a camera that looks at each of these grapes as it's falling off of the hopper here. And you have a little thing of air jet that shoots any berries that aren't up to par and reject them out of the blend. So this is how a optical sorter works. In a density sorter, it's a water and sugar solution. So any grapes that are riper, essentially, then this water sugar solution will sink to the bottom. Any grapes that aren't ripe enough will float to the top and be discarded. We destem grapes in Bordeaux. There are some producers that are experimenting with not destemming or partial destemming, but the Bordeaux grape varieties, they have enough body and tannin. They don't need the extra oomph and grip that's added from the stems. We see fermentation and aging in many different vessels: stainless steel, concrete, wood, including American wood, especially in the kind of the AOC Bordeaux, or sometimes in the Côtes Bordeaux. Most producers practice remotage, which is the pumping over of the juice onto the cap during fermentation, which is much softer and gentler than pigage, which is the more Burgundy style of cap management, as we would call it, pigage, is punching down with sort of like a plunger, the cap of skins into the juice during fermentation. This breaks up the skins more, it extracts more color and more tannin. You don't necessarily need to do this in Bordeaux. We have enough color and tannin as there is. Malolactic fermentation or malolactic conversion was not always that well understood in Bordeaux, and the quality greatly increased once it was. Almost all red wines go through the secondary conversion of tart malic acid into softer lactic acid. And then some estates employ microbrewage or microoxygenation or cliquage. The microbrewage was created sort of established in Maturin in the 1990s. It's a technique that filter tiny small air bubbles through a wine. You can do this in a like an oak barrel, or sometimes in like a stainless steel tank with oak chips or oak powder, and it really helps soften more green, harsh tannic edges of a wine. It would create it in Maturin for the Tannat grape, which is intensely tannic. Microoxygenation is really encouraged by the Michel Rolland school of thought of producing more accessible wine younger on, not waiting for the tannin to necessarily resolve themselves. And cliquage is a little bit more controversial because this includes inserting oxygen into wine while it's in barrel. And this sort of is supposed to mimic the concept of racking the wine, the oxygen exposure that you would get through racking. But a lot of the critics of cliquage and microbrewage as well discuss that it's a very short-term gain at the expense of long-term stability in these wines. So what type of Bordeaux are you looking for? Bordeaux to drink, buy and drink tonight, or Bordeaux to buy and drink in 10 or 15 years, right? Most wines are aged in oak for 18 to 24 months. We use barrique, which is a unit of measurement of 225 liter. And most estates these days produce a second wine. Not all do. Second wines were also sort of created by an enologist, a consultant named Émile Peynaud. And the reason that we created a lot of these second wines for estates was to actually increase the quality of their top wine, their Grand Vin. So prior to the concept of the second wine, all of the vineyards, all of the grapes from all of a Château's vineyard would go into their one wine, right? What we kind of call the Grand Vin within Bordeaux. And Émile Peynaud said, well, maybe when you have vineyard lots that aren't the best, or certain vintages where some of your grapes didn't do as well, or younger vines, why don't you keep those and bottle those separately to keep the quality of the top wine. So this is what began a lot of these second wines. Today, many estates and chateaus have vineyards that are specifically for their second wine. Some estates and chateaus will use younger vines, and their second wine is really common as well. So the younger wine is usually about a third of the price of the Grand Vin, and it's usually ready for much earlier drinking than the top quality wine as well. So there's a lot of really famous second wines. I have a really cool sheet of like all of the classified growths and their second wines that I'll probably go ahead and send out for you guys tomorrow too. So you can look that over. It's really in-depth and nerdy, but you could have it if you were ever curious. So we're talking about the Livonais. This is the heart of quality on the right bank. Saint-Émilion and Pomerol are your top appellations. So this is what we're really going to be talking about, right? They have a satellite appellation that form an arc around both of those, Pomerol and Saint-Émilion. You have Lalande de Pomerol. It's the only satellite appellation for Pomerol. And then Saint-Émilion has 4 not really distinct satellite appellations. There's not really a lot that really defines each of these satellite appellations from another. Fronsac and Canon-Fronsac lie to the west. Canon-Fronsac is the smaller area located sort of sub-nested inside of Fronsac, known for slightly higher quality And then the Côtes Bordeaux Castillon is to the east. It has the same limestone terroir that we see in Saint-Émilion, and the Côtes Bordeaux Francs, which lies just to the east of Lussac, Saint-Émilion. This is where you find Château Le Py, that estate we mentioned earlier, that's looking for classification as their own AOC for their estate. So last time with Ryan, you probably talked a lot about the classifications of the left bank, of which there are many. You have the Cru Artisan, you have the 1855 classification of Medoc, you have the 1957 classification of the Graves, you have the Cru Bourgeois classification of 2020. There's only one classification of the right bank, but it is a little bit convoluted. So it's the only region, as we know, on the right bank to have a classification of a chateau. The first classification took place in 1955, and it followed the precedent of the left bank. So it classified the chateau rather than the land itself. Initially, the intention was to revise every decade the classification, but today it's only been revised 4 times. The next revision is actually coming up this year in 2022. So we're going to talk about what's going on with that. So today, the criteria include the price, the quality of the wine, and the terroir. And this is a departure from the 1855 classification. In Saint-Émilion, if a producer or a chateau acquires new vineyards, they're not automatically allowed to use them in the classified wine. So that's different than the left bank, where if a producer Lafitte buys new vineyards, they can automatically use those vineyards as long as they're from Pauillac in their top classified wine. So the first 3 revisions were pretty minor. They didn't, raise a lot of interest, but the 2006 revision had a ton of controversy around it. It was thrown out due to legal challenges from several chateaux that were demoted during the 2006 classification. So the next classification didn't take place until 2012, which is the one that stands today. This classification included more properties, and it increased the size of the current classified estates. Something else that was really important was that the Saint-Émilion Wine Council shifted the authority of the classification to the INAO, so the governing body of wine in France, and they created an appeal process for any chateau that would be demoted. So it was conducted in 2012 entirely by the INAO, and the principles that it kind of encompassed included an analysis of the soil, topography, viticultural and winemaking techniques, an examination of the estate's reputation, and a tasting spanning a decade of vintages. But it also looked at things like tourism and marketing of the estate too. So keep that in mind. Since 2012, there are 3 classes of the classification of Saint-Émilion. So the first is the Premier Grand Cru Classé, and that's further subdivided into 2 groups. So Premier Cru Classé A, which includes the chateaux of Assonne and Cheval Blanc, which were classified in 1955, and Chateau Angelus and Chateau Pavie, which were upgraded and classified as Premier Cru Classé A in 2012. 14 chateaux were classified in 2012 as Premier Cru Classé B. So this includes like Chateau Figeac, which we'll talk about. Another 63 chateaux are classified simply as Grand Cru Classé. So they don't have the Premier on the front of the wording in this case. Now, all producers in Saint-Émilion are authorized to describe themselves as Saint-Émilion Grand Cru. So essentially, the AOC is either Saint-Émilion or Saint-Émilion Grand Cru. And this is where it gets really confusing, because a Grand Cru Classé is a classified estate, but a Saint-Émilion Grand Cru is not. So keep that in mind, because you'll see both of those terms on a label. It has to say Classé to be part of this classification. However, in 2001, Assonne and Cheval Blanc withdrew from the classification, and Chateau Angelus said that they will not reapply for their classification in 2022. So producers are not necessarily happy with the way that the classification was rewritten in 2012. So now the most popular and famous estates, 3 of the Premier Cru Classe A, will not be part of the classification at all. They'll still be part of Saint-Émilion AOC or Saint-Émilion Grand Cru AOC, but they won't be a classified estate because they chose not to put themselves up for reclassification. Crazy stuff. I'll send an article on that so you can look at it more on your own. And I know we're getting a little late on time, but there's not a ton left to talk about because I'm probably going to send out something with like producers and vintages because there's just so much to carry to cover in these classes. And I know I always like to say, like, the point of these is not to tell you everything right now that you need to know, but to give you the foundation so that you can explore what you're interested in more on your own, right? So I hope that that's what we're doing here. So we know that Saint-Émilion AOP and Saint-Émilion Grand Cru AOP, they're the same, they're interchangeable, and one is not better than the other. So that's a really important thing to consider as well. The poet Ausonius lived here in the 4th century. His name lives on in Château Ausone as well. Sorry, Danielle, with that text for us, what are you thinking? She might be gone already. Okay. So sorry, back to that. Close out my text screen here. So Ausonius lived here in the 4th century, a Roman poet. His name lives on in Château Ausone. We know that there's a lot of influence of Roman culture here, as we mentioned. There are many different terroirs within this appellation. It follows medieval boundaries as opposed to geological boundaries. Saint-Émilion is at the center of the appellation. And the majority of the chateaux that surround the village of Saint-Émilion are many of the Premier Grand Cru or Premier Cru Classe B estates, and including 3 of the Classe A estates. So that would include Château Ausone, which we have, sorry, my cursor is not working. So we have Ausone, we have Pavie, and we have Angelus. And then the 4th is Cheval Blanc, which is located over at the edge of the appellation, right next to Pomerol, which we'll be talking about in a moment as well. They have a really great terroir for Cabernet Franc. If you're looking at the difference between Pomerol and Saint-Émilion, Saint-Émilion usually has a higher proportion of Cabernet Franc. The exception would be many of the states that are just across the border in Pomerol, which do include a higher portion of Cabernet Franc in their wines as well. The later harvest on the plateau, you have more limestone and cool clay soils in this area. Towards around the plateau, you see more sand. So these craft lighter styles of Saint-Émilion. Sandstone in the north, slightly lighter, and alluvial soils in the south. Your most concentrated versions will be on this sort of middle plateau that's located around the town of Saint-Émilion itself. And then there's also a really interesting area that's a kind of gravel strip that runs here just along the side with Pomerol over here. So this is where you see Cheval Blanc, which has a pretty high proportion of Cabernet Franc in its wines, comparatively for Saint-Émilion. Usually the blend is like 70 to 85% Merlot with Cabernet Franc, but Cheval Blanc is almost half and half, like 50% Cabernet Franc, 50% Merlot. And Château Figeac, which is a Premier Cru Classe B, is known for using a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon in their wine. So the Figeac wines are usually a 3rd blend of Cabernet Franc, Merlot, and Cabernet Sauvignon. So they're a little bit of an outlier within the region as well. We know that since 2019, all viticulture must be certified sustainable in order to use Saint-Émilion on your label of wine. And the average size of the classified estate is quite small. It's only around 16 hectares. The estates are a lot more modest. We talked about Michel Roland, Les Bons Pasteurs, just across the border in Pomerol, who had to sell his estate because his siblings wanted to cash out. And we saw a lot of the garage wines really start in this area with Château de Valendraud, which is now classified as a Grand Cru Classe as well. But a lot of these estates were excluded from the initial classification. La Mondotte, Le Dôme, Château Gracia, Château Margrez as well, Bellevue Mondotte, and Valendraud, which we talked about, are some of the top garage wines that you do see. Their style has become a bit more restrained than it was in the 90s when it was really, really all about opulence. So today we see a lot more balance in those wines than we might have seen back in those times as well. We have the satellite appellations that sit just across the Barbane stream. They're a lot more clay and limestone, just like Saint-Émilion. They tend to be a little bit cooler. They sit further from the Dordogne River. Lussac Saint-Émilion has the second largest production next to Montagne de Saint-Émilion. Green, which is located here in the eastern side, just next to the Côte de France. It's the highest elevation. They're one of the last to harvest. And St. George Emilion is the smallest in size and production. And the producers here, they really aim for a similar style to Saint-Émilion, but they tend to have a lot less intensity than you find. Some of those reasonings have to do with the price of the wine as it sells it and the amount of money that they can put back into their vineyards and their winery as well. But the quality and the style is usually driven more by the estate than necessarily the individual satellite. I think it's really interesting. I'm not sure why they decided to classify these 4 satellites. There were initially more, but they were absorbed by the others as they were rarely ever seen on labels either. You see more cooperatives here, machine harvesting, American oak can be quite common. One of the top producers that you do see within the region is Château Rose Perrier as well, so keep a lookout for that. In Lalande de Pomerol, the single satellite appellation for Pomerol, you also see more varied soils, a higher proportion of gravel within this region, but the best of the vineyards have the Croix de Fer, which is the iron-rich deposit that we'll talk about in Pomerol as well, that run beneath them. It's less than a 5-minute drive from the greatest Pomerol Chateau. So there's not a lot of space in between. And it's interesting to see, because of this sort of undulating landscape, how different these areas actually can be, despite being so close to each other. The wines are a little bit more solid here, less refined than what you might find in Pomerol. Pavillon Beauregard, the producer in Pomerol that makes wine across the border, in Lalande de Pomerol, Bertineau St. Vincent, and Fleur de Bouard are all producers to look for in the Lalande de Pomerol satellite. So Pomerol is the epitome of Merlot, right? We know it was heavily planted after the 1956 freeze. The average estate is much smaller here, 6-7 hectares. There's only about 150 producers. There's no classification of the vineyards or the estate of Pomerol. Just across the border from Saint-Émilion, the estates tend to have more Cabernet Franc. The exception would be Petrus, which is almost always one of Bordeaux's only single varietal wine that typically is 100% Merlot. But if you look at Beauregard or Conseillant or Les Evangiles, or even Gazine, or it actually doesn't show it, but Le Bon Pasteur is right here as well. These are all estates that do encompass more Cabernet Franc within their blend. There's actually 3 separate terraces that we do see that were formed by Ice Age deposits of these kind of sand, gravel, clay, alluvial deposits that we see begin to accumulate as the slopes of the plateau go upward. The 3rd terrace is the highest elevation, and that has the purest water retaining clay soil. This is where Petrus is located. We're going to talk about their soil in just a moment. I guess now, as I read down the slides. So during the last ice age, it created this clay that was pushed up from the lower areas of the earth. It's kind of this blue clay that's known as buttonhole, and it really gives Petrus its really unique character. The surrounding estate around Petrus also share some of this soil type, but Petrus is the only one that really covers it in its entirety. So it's the only estate that is primarily on this sort of special buttonhole soil. The other ones share that soil with other types around it as well, more sand and gravel, as opposed to just this blue clay. So that's one of the reasons that they're known for being able to produce this really kind of like rich, voluptuous, like really velvety, like really intense and plush style of Merlot that is still incredibly balanced, had this refinement of tannins, but still had the acidity that stands up to this plushness. And, you know, oftentimes in wine, we say this area has precision and tenacity and intensity, right? And this area is plush and full and round. And usually the best vineyards, what we would call the Grand Crus or the best estates, have everything. They have this sense of plush roundness with still this precision that balances that out. They have the tannin that masks or manages the opulence of fruit, right? And this is kind of what Petrus does. It is a complete wine. It has a little bit of everything. As we move deeper into the appellation, we have estates that have a higher concentration of Merlot than what we see closer to the border with Saint-Émilion, usually between 80 and 90%. So they show this really intense ripeness that we've come to expect from Pomerol as well. And then away from the plateau, we see varying proportions of sand and gravel. The wines are lighter and fruitier, but there are very few inexpensive wines in Pomerol because of the small size of the appellation and the prestige of its top estates. I would say that the halo effect is really in effect in Pomerol. So there really are very few wines that I would call inexpensive within this region as well. We will expect plantings of Merlot to decrease in favor of Cabernet Franc with global warming. I've already seen some differences in, depending on where you look in the text or your resource, at what percentage of Merlot is already planted. So the source that I used said 85%, but I saw other sources that said 70%. The Mouex family is incredibly important here. Jean-Francois owned Château Petrus, and his cousin Christian Mouex, who we know also owned Dominus in California, one of the best estates in California for Cabernet Sauvignon, also owned Château Trotanoy, Lafleur Petrus, and Hosanna. Trotanoy is the closest to Petrus in style. Lafleur Petrus is kind of a lighter and fruitier, and Hosanna actually encompasses a little bit more Cabernet Franc. So it does have a little bit more attention and structure to the wine in Hosanna, as opposed to some of the Mouex family's other properties that you see. And Le Pin is really the most popular garage wine that you will find in Pomerol as well. It usually sells for the same price as you would find Petrus. If anybody's had any of these wines, I would be happy to hear about that. So Fronsac and Canon Fronsac, two areas that were really important in the 18th century, maybe the most prized in Bordeaux. They were served at the Palace of Versailles. And because of this, a lot of 18th and 19th century chateaux do dot the landscape here as well. So we're really seeing a resurgence within these regions. They're also known for Merlot. It tends to have a little bit less refinement than Pomerol. In all of Bordeaux, I think it's interesting, the highest percentage of Chinese-owned estates are here. But I think that has to do with, as we mentioned before, the taxes, the price of keeping up these really grand old chateaux is a lot. So we're selling them to companies that can really afford this upkeep, which is a good thing, that we're able to keep these like really incredible historical sites, right? I think it's pretty cool. Canon Fronsac is smaller. It's a little bit more uniform in terms of its soil type, with a softer limestone and clay. The top Fronsac estates are Château Fontenille, which is owned by Michel Rolland. If anybody had not seen a documentary called Mondo Vino, it talked quite a bit about Michel Rolland. He's kind of maligned as being in line with sort of the Parkerization of wine. He's a consulting flying winemaker. He flies all over the world, and he consults for a lot of different Cabernet-based estates, both in Bordeaux and around the world. And some of his critics say that he's homogenizing the style of wine. He likes to recommend that people make it in a very specific style. You know, this is a little bit hyperbolic because he does go in and he says, he gives them options for what they can do. But one of the criticisms is that he's making all Bordeaux and all Cabernet around the world taste the same, right? But after he lost Les Bons Pasteurs, he purchased Château Fontenille. So this is now his personal estate located in Fronsac. You find Grand Renouilly and Château Gabi are really fantastic in the smaller area of Canon Fronsac as well. And then Bly and Borg, it was much harder to find a great map of this one. Located at the northern extremity of the right bank. These are fairly cool climates as well. They've been growing vines since the Roman times in this area. But the wine trade really suffered with the development of the Medoc across the river in this region. It suffered greatly from the 19th century epidemics that we discussed, phylloxera, downy mildew, powdery mildew, etc. And a lot of the wine prior to the actual delimiting of the Cognac area in 1909, a lot of the grape that Bly would grow actually went into the pot stills of Cognac, which you can see here. This is where we find actually the highest plantings of Cabernet Sauvignon on the right bank, and actually one of the largest holdouts from Malbec in Bordeaux as well. We see a little bit more of that planted here. Borg is the smaller of the two AOPs. So when we consolidated the Côtes de Bordeaux, Borg initially was supposed to be grouped in with that consolidation, but they said no. And so they retained their autonomy, I guess you would say. They're their own region. So Bly is bigger, it's more expansive, there's more mixed agriculture. Merlot is the more dominant grape. They have one of the, which is interesting, one of the longest minimum élevage periods in the Gironde. The red can't be sold until March 31st of the second year after the harvest, which I think is really interesting. And Bly is also really convoluted in a little bit of its labeling. So you'll see a lot of terms for Bly. The red can be labeled as Bly AOP or Côtes de Bordeaux AOP, with or without the Bly designation included with that. You do have white wine coming from Bly. It can be labeled as Premier Côte de Bly, Côtes de Bordeaux, or as Côtes de Bordeaux, which is a blend of Semillon or Sauvignon Blanc. But the Côtes de Bly AOP are white blends from Uni Blanc and Colombard, which are two of the main grapes, or the main two grapes that you see in the Cognac region. Château Roque de Cam and Fougas Maldoror are both really well known within the region as well. This is the last one we're talking about, guys. Sorry to keep you so late. So the Côtes de Bordeaux is a pretty recent concept since 2009. So most côtes in France indicate an area that rises above the generic AOP or some sort of a slope. That is not necessarily true here. It was previously 5 separate côtes. So it was Borg, Bly, Cadillac, Castillon, and Francs. People were very confused by the excess number of AOPs in Bordeaux. So we decided to merge them into this more single côte. Now, I don't know if this was necessarily less confusing because they're not next to each other. They don't line up. They are not, they're not congruent. They're disconnected, right? Côtes de Bordeaux did not agree. It remains its own independent AOP, so it's not now part of the consolidation, which is known as the Côtes de Bordeaux. The other 4 disconnected sectors are in individual areas, and each can label themselves simply as Côtes de Bordeaux, or also has the option to append their own name. So that's what we saw in the first wine that we're drinking, the Castillon Côtes de Bordeaux. Côtes de Bordeaux Francs is located here, Bly Côtes de Bordeaux, which we were just talking about, but then Cadillac Côtes de Bordeaux is located in the Entrée du Mur. So it's not even located on the right bank, but you could technically blend any of these or make wine from any of them and call them the Côtes de Bordeaux. So it's a little bit confusing, and it's a pretty high production of the Bordeaux wine that is produced, so around 14%. The Côte de Castillon, which we'll talk about over here, it's an extension again of that limestone plateau of Saint-Émilion. The wines here, this is one of really kind of the best unknown areas of Bordeaux because the wines really do tend to reflect the terroir. Many producers from Saint-Émilion are making outposts here. They're looking for vineyards at reasonable prices that really reflect the terroir of the region. The top wines are equivalent to Saint-Émilion and have a similar aging potential. And a lot of the wines are, unfortunately, though, are declassified to simple Bordeaux AOP. So what are we going to look for when we're drinking right bank Bordeaux? So I'm going to send out a list of this, so we don't necessarily need to sit here and go over all of the different vintages. I didn't include every vintage that necessarily wasn't the best, especially as we got past the 2000s. But in general, the trend to warmer vintages did start in 1982. The years zigzag between these increasingly riper conditions and the more classic conditions. Classic would be more restrained fruit and higher but balanced acidity and tannin to the wine. And they oftentimes take many years to unfurl and soften that tannin and resolve it in the bottle itself. Historically, the vignerons would expect that in a decade, you would have 3 great years, 3 bad years, and 4 years that were just in between of those two. So you can kind of see that in bold, I've listed some of the best years: 2016, 15, 10, and 9, 05, 04, 2000, 95 was really fantastic, 96 was good, 91 through 94 were all terrible. And this was a big blow to Bordeaux after the really fantastic vintages of the 1980s. We had a lot of really standout vintages in the 80s. 1990 was really fantastic, and 91 to 94 were terrible. But I always like to say, take a look at who the producer is, because unless it's 2003, which was such a hot vintage, it didn't turn out very well for Bordeaux at all. You know, I would like to say, think about who the producer is, because they probably can make a pretty good wine even in a poor year. But one of the other things to consider with Bordeaux is, you know, that unfortunately you have to think about, because the wines are often aged, you also have to consider the provenance of where the bottles have been stored and aged at. So that can be something that a little bit confusing and can be difficult to look out for as well. So if you're purchasing Bordeaux, if you're purchasing something in a large quantity or for a higher dollar amount, definitely consider doing a little bit of research on the company that you're buying from and making sure that, you know, the provenance of the wine and how it's been stored over time have been good for the bottle itself. So, thank you guys. Sorry I went over tonight. I didn't mean to. There was a lot to cover. I tried to do a little bit less time on history, and next time I will, and we'll talk a little bit more. But I'll send out, I really want to get more into some producers, and I've been thinking about maybe creating my own sort of producer profile for the right bank of Bordeaux, and also understanding who owned what chateau, like who the Moueix family owns. We can talk about like Stephen Derencourt. It's really, really important within the region too. We'll talk about Michel Roland and what he's done there. So I think I'll send up with the recording a little bit more information that you guys can explore on your own. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Nice to see you all. It was so much to cover. But we'll talk soon. Everyone have a great night. Enjoy your wines.